May 1940.
Dunkirk, France.
The world is ending in fire and smoke. 500,000 men are trapped, running toward the sea. And in the middle of this mechanized hell, where bullets come faster than thought and tanks crush bone into mud, one British officer crouches behind a crumbling stone wall, pulls back the string of a 6-foot medieval longbow, and sends an arrow screaming through the chest of a German sergeant. The first longbow kill in a European war in over 300 years. His name is Jack Churchill. And this is only the beginning. The air above Dunkirk tasted like iron and ash. Lieutenant John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. Jack, to those who knew him, Mad Jack, to those who would come to fear and revere him, pressed his back against the cold stone wall, feeling the vibrations of explosions traveling through the ancient mortar. Around him, the world had dissolved into chaos. The British Expeditionary Force was collapsing, fragmenting, bleeding out across the French countryside in a desperate scramble toward the beaches. Men ran without formation, without orders, driven only by the primal need to reach the channel before the panzers did. But Jack Churchill was not running. His fingers moved with the precision of a concert violinist, drawing an arrow from the leather quiver at his hip. The arrow's fletching was gray goose feather, traditional, the same kind used at Agincourt 5 centuries before. The shaft was ash wood, 30 inches long, tipped with a steel broadhead honed to surgical sharpness. He had made these arrows himself back in England, in a world that now seemed impossibly distant. A world where war still had rules, where officers wore dress uniforms and spoke of honor, where the word Blitzkrieg was just a rumor whispered in war office corridors. That world was dead now, burned away in 6 weeks of mechanized slaughter. Churchill knocked the arrow, his breathing slow and deliberate despite the cacophony around him. The longbow in his hands was not a relic or an affectation. It was a weapon he had trained with since childhood, a tool he understood with the intimacy that other men reserved for lovers or religion. The bow was English yew, 6 feet of spring steel disguised as wood, capable of sending an arrow through chainmail at 200 yards. In the hands of a master, and Churchill was indisputably a master, it could kill as efficiently as any rifle. More importantly, it could kill silently. Through a gap in the wall, Churchill watched the German patrol moving through the rubble-strewn street. 5 men, moving in a loose tactical formation, rifles at the ready, scanning the ruins for British stragglers. They wore the field-gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht, coal-scuttle helmets catching the orange glow of burning buildings. One of them, a sergeant Churchill could tell from the insignia, was barking orders, directing his men to search a collapsed building to the left. Churchill's heartbeat slowed. The world narrowed to a tunnel. In that tunnel, there was only the sergeant, the arrow, and the mathematics of death. He could hear his grandfather's voice, a ghost from summer afternoons in the Scottish Highlands. A longbow is not about strength, lad. It's about timing, about becoming the weapon. You don't aim at your target. You become the line between bow and target, and the arrow merely travels that line. Churchill rose smoothly from behind the wall, drawing the bowstring back to his ear in one fluid motion. The bow creaked, a sound lost in the thunder of distant artillery. 90 pounds of draw weight compressed into potential energy. The sergeant was perhaps 60 yards away, turned partly in profile, his attention on the building. Churchill exhaled half a breath and released. The arrow left the string with a whisper, a susurration of death cutting through smoke and fire. For a heartbeat, Churchill watched its arc, a dark line against the gray sky. Then it struck. The broadhead punched through the sergeant's tunic just below the ribcage, angled upward, penetrating lung and heart. The man's mouth opened in surprise. Not pain, not yet, the shock was too sudden, and his rifle clattered to the cobblestones. He took one stumbling step forward, as if he might walk away from his own death, then collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. The other Germans froze, confused. Where had the shot come from? There had been no gunfire, no muzzle flash. Their sergeant was simply down an arrow, an actual medieval arrow, jutting from his chest like something from a fever dream. Churchill was already moving, melting back into the ruins before the patrol could locate him. His boots made no sound on the rubble. He had learned stealth in the jungles of Burma, hunting bandits and tigers with equal enthusiasm before the war. He had learned patience in the mountains of Scotland, waiting hours for a single clean shot at a stag. Now, in this mechanized nightmare, those old skills, the skills of another century, gave him an edge that technology could not match. Silent, invisible, deadly. Behind him, he could hear the Germans shouting, their voices tight with fear. Good. Fear was a weapon too. Fear made men stupid, made them hesitate, made them question their orders and their training. A man killed by a bullet understood his death. War was bullets, war was machines, war made sense in its own terrible way. But a man killed by an arrow? That violated the logic of modern warfare. That reached back through centuries to touch something primal and terrifying. Churchill moved through the skeletal remains of what had once been a residential neighborhood. The houses were gutted, their walls blown out by shellfire, their insides exposed like anatomical diagrams. Furniture lay scattered in the streets. A child's doll, its porcelain face cracked. A family portrait in a shattered frame. A table set for dinner that would never be eaten. The debris of ordinary life, transformed overnight into a surreal battlefield gallery. Somewhere in the distance, Stuka dive bombers howled their descending scream, and new explosions rippled across the town. The ground shook. Plaster dust cascaded from damaged walls, hanging in the air like fog. Churchill kept moving, his longbow in one hand, his other hand resting on the pommel of the Scottish broadsword strapped to his back. The sword was another inheritance from his grandfather. A basket-hilted claymore, blade 36 inches long, perfectly balanced, capable of severing limbs or heads with equal efficiency. Churchill had trained in its use with the same dedication he'd brought to archery, studying Highland broadsword technique from old manuals and aging veterans. His friends had thought it eccentric, this obsession with medieval weaponry. The War Office had considered it borderline mad when he'd insisted on bringing both bow and sword with him to France. Now, with the British Army in full retreat and modern warfare revealing itself as an industrial abattoir, Churchill's eccentricity was keeping him alive. Over the next 3 days that would blur into a single sustained nightmare of smoke, blood, and steel, Churchill continued his private war. While tens of thousands of British soldiers stumbled toward Dunkirk's beaches in exhausted columns, while the Luftwaffe strafed refugee-choked roads and panzers prowled the French countryside, Churchill moved through the chaos like a ghost from another era, hunting. The second German sergeant died with an arrow through his throat, 50 yards from a burning farmhouse. He had been ordering his men to set up a machine gun position, had been pointing at a cluster of British soldiers trying to surrender. Churchill's arrow arrived first, the broadhead severing carotid and jugular, spraying blood across the machine gun's tripod. The sergeant collapsed, gurgling, drowning in his own blood, and his men scattered, convinced they were under sniper attack from multiple positions. The third died at a crossroads, shot through the shoulder. Not a killing wound, but enough to spin him around and make him scream. His screams drew his squad out from cover, and Churchill, already repositioning, shot 2 more before melting back into a hedgerow. For arrows, 3 men down, 1 wounded. Economics of violence that any medieval archer would have understood. The 4th and 5th died together, standing too close while examining a British rifle they'd captured. Churchill's arrow passed through the first man's neck and lodged in the second man's chest. A double kill that would have been impossible with a rifle, but the longbow's penetration power, the same power that had punched through French knights' armor at Crécy, made it almost routine. Churchill stopped counting after 7. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the effect. German patrols became cautious, jumpy, convinced that British snipers were everywhere. Officers started giving their sergeants and NCOs, the backbone of any infantry unit, wider spacing, making them harder to kill but also harder to command. The psychological impact rippled outward, a single man with a bow creating paranoia across entire sectors. But Churchill felt no satisfaction, no triumph. War wasn't glorious. It never had been, despite what the poets and propagandists claimed. War was noise and confusion, was men screaming for their mothers in languages they'd spent their whole lives speaking, was the smell of ruptured bowels and burned flesh, was the moment when you realized the person you just killed had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd probably been conscripted against his will and was just as terrified as you were. The bow and sword weren't about glory. They were about survival, about maintaining some thread of control in a world that had gone insane with industrial efficiency. When you killed a man with an arrow you'd made yourself, when you felt the bow's recoil in your palm and watched the arrow's flight, you were connected to that death in a way that pulling a trigger could never match. It made you responsible. It made you human. And humanity, Churchill was discovering, was the first casualty of modern war. On the third day, he finally reached the beaches. Dunkirk stretched before him like a vision from Dante, a purgatorial landscape of sand, smoke, and suffering. Hundreds of thousands of men crowded the waterline, standing in patient queues that stretched into the surf, waiting for boats that might never come. The Luftwaffe circled overhead like patient vultures, dropping bombs into the packed masses. Each explosion sent geysers of sand and water skyward, sent bodies tumbling like rag dolls. The wounded lay in rows along the dunes, their cries lost in the greater cacophony. Churchill stood at the edge of this apocalypse, his longbow in one hand, his sword strapped to his back, his uniform caked with dust and blood, some his own, most belonging to others. Around him, men stared with hollow eyes, traumatized beyond speech. They'd marched to France with brass bands playing, with flags flying, with speeches about defending civilization. Now they huddled in the sand, praying for rescue, reduced to their most basic instincts. Survive, endure, escape. Churchill joined the queue. He did not abandon his weapons. When a naval officer on one of the destroyers suggested he leave the medieval equipment behind to make more room for men, Churchill smiled, a tight, humorless expression, and said simply, "These come with me or I go back." The officer, recognizing something in Churchill's eyes that transcended rank or regulation, waved him aboard. The destroyer HMS Vanquisher pulled away from the mole with its decks packed so tightly that men couldn't sit without sitting on other men. Churchill stood near the rail, watching Dunkirk recede through curtains of smoke. Above, German bombers howled and dove. Around the ship, the channel erupted in waterspouts. Men prayed, vomited, wept. Churchill stood silent, his hands resting on his bow, his thoughts elsewhere. He thought about his grandfather, teaching him archery in the Highlands while explaining that a warrior's weapons defined not just how he fought, but who he was. He thought about the German sergeant, the first man he'd killed with the bow, the look of surprise in the instant before death. He thought about history, about how war had supposedly evolved beyond swords and arrows into something clean and modern and efficient, and how that evolution had produced Dunkirk, 500,000 men fleeing in terror from machines designed for slaughter. The evacuation of Dunkirk would be hailed as a miracle, a triumph of British spirit. Churchill knew the truth. It was a catastrophic defeat barely disguised as a success. The BF had been routed. France was falling. Britain stood alone. But defeat could be a beginning as well as an ending. London 3 months later. A nondescript building in Whitehall, where men with hard eyes and soft voices planned operations that couldn't officially exist. Churchill sat across from a brigadier whose name he didn't catch and probably wasn't real anyway. "Commandos," the brigadier said, studying Churchill's file with the expression of a man examining an interesting but potentially dangerous curiosity. "Small units, raiding parties, hit Jerry where he doesn't expect, 'cause maximum chaos, then disappear before he can respond. Irregular warfare. We're looking for men who think differently." He tapped the file where someone had paper-clipped a note. "Fought with longbow and sword at Dunkirk. Confirmed 7 kills. Possibly insane. Definitely useful. We need officers who can lead from the front, who aren't bound by conventional thinking, who can improvise and adapt. Your record suggests you might qualify." The brigadier's pause was eloquent. "Though there are some concerns about your methodology." Churchill met his gaze levelly. War is fundamentally about imposing your will on the enemy. Sometimes psychology matters more than firepower. A man killed by an arrow dies just as dead as a man killed by a bullet, but his comrades remember it differently. They tell stories. They start to wonder if their enemy is entirely human. Doubt spreads faster than bullets. The brigadier considered this, then smiled. A thin, predatory expression. Welcome to the Commandos, Captain Churchill. I think you'll fit right in. The Special Service Brigade, British Commandos, became Churchill's spiritual home. Here, among men who'd volunteered for suicide missions and considered conventional warfare boring, his eccentricities weren't liabilities but assets. The bow, sword, and his latest addition, Highland bagpipes, became his signature. Training was brutal, designed to weed out everyone except the absolutely dedicated. Route marches of 50 miles carrying full kit. Live-fire exercises where mistakes meant death. Unarmed combat instruction from Shanghai policemen who'd fought triad enforcers in alley knife fights. Cliff climbing, small boat handling, demolitions, silent killing. Churchill excelled at all of it, but particularly at the psychological aspects. He understood, instinctively, that commandos weren't just soldiers, they were ghosts, demons, nightmares given flesh. Their job was to appear from nowhere, inflict maximum damage, and vanish, leaving the enemy paranoid and demoralized. Every operation was theater as much as warfare, a performance designed to convince the Germans that the British were capable of striking anywhere, anytime. And nothing said, "We're coming for you in ways you can't predict," quite like an officer carrying a medieval arsenal. December 1941. Operation Archery. The Norwegian island of Vagsøy, occupied by German forces, converted into a fortified position protecting shipping lanes. The commandos would raid the island, destroy military installations, capture prisoners, and generally remind the Germans that Norway's coast was 3,000 miles of vulnerable target. Churchill's unit approached in landing craft through pre-dawn darkness. The sea black and heaving, spray freezing on men's faces. The craft pitched and rolled, men gripping rails and each other, many vomiting over the side. The Norwegian coast materialized from the darkness. Dark cliffs crowned with darker forests, here and there the orange glow of German positions. As the landing craft's ramp dropped and men prepared to charge into waist-deep freezing water, Churchill did something that would become legend. He stood at the craft's bow, drew his bagpipes from their case and began to play. The pibroch, a classical Highland war tune, centuries old, wailed across the black water. Its notes were wild, alien, utterly incongruous with the modern machinery of war surrounding them. German sentries on the beach froze, trying to process what their ears were telling them. Was this a trick? Some kind of signal? Who the hell played bagpipes in the middle of a combat landing? Churchill played for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to utterly confuse the enemy, short enough that German machine guns were still trying to locate the source when he stopped. Then he laid down the pipes, drew a grenade, pulled the pin, and hurled it toward the nearest German position with the same smooth motion he'd used for a cricket ball. The grenade exploded in a gout of orange flame. Churchill drew his broadsword, held it high so every man could see it silhouetted against the flash, and charged into the surf. "Forward!" he roared. Behind him, commandos poured from the landing craft, energized by their captain's absolute madness, convinced that a man who could play bagpipes under fire couldn't possibly be killed by something as mundane as bullets. The Germans, still processing the bagpipes, found themselves facing a screaming officer with a sword in one hand and a pistol in the other, splashing through the surf like something from a Wagnerian opera filtered through a nightmare. Their response was fatally delayed. 2-3 seconds of stunned confusion, which was exactly what Churchill needed. He reached the beach at a dead run, sword swinging in broad arcs, pistol barking. German positions exploded as other commandos tossed grenades and fired Thompson submachine guns. The carefully planned defensive line dissolved into chaos. Germans retreated, fighting or fleeing depending on temperament and training, falling back towards secondary positions. Churchill didn't slow. Commandos operated on momentum, hit fast, hit hard, keep the enemy off balance until the objective was secured. He led his men through Vagsøy's narrow streets, kicking in doors, tossing grenades into buildings, his sword and pistol working in brutal synchronization. At one point, he cornered 3 German soldiers in a warehouse, disarmed them with economical violence, and marched them back toward British lines at sword point, their hands on their heads, their faces reflecting pure confusion about what had just happened to them. The raid lasted 6 hours. By the time the Commandos withdrew, they'd destroyed German artillery positions, demolished a fish oil factory the Germans used for glycerin production, captured dozens of prisoners, and killed or wounded over 100 enemy soldiers. British casualties were relatively light. The Norwegians who'd suffered under occupation cheered from their windows as the raiders withdrew, seeing proof that Britain hadn't forgotten them. Churchill reboarded the landing craft with his sword still in hand, his tunic torn, a fresh scar across his cheek from flying glass, his expression somewhere between exhilaration and exhaustion. Around him, commandos grinned through the adrenaline crash, passing around flasks of rum, slapping each other's backs, already embellishing the story of Mad Jack and his bagpipes. The legend was beginning to solidify. Over the next 2 years, Churchill fought across the Mediterranean and into Italy. Each operation added layers to his growing mythology. He led night raids where his commandos struck from the sea, destroyed German installations, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. He fought in the mountains of Yugoslavia, coordinating with Tito's partisans, teaching them commando tactics while they taught him the brutal realities of guerrilla warfare in occupied territory. Always, the bow and sword remained part of his arsenal. Not as primary weapons, Churchill wasn't suicidal, but as psychological tools, as silent alternatives when stealth mattered more than firepower, as symbols that unnerved enemies and inspired allies. During one operation in Sicily, he captured a German observation post by scaling a cliff his enemies had considered unclimbable, appearing behind their position like a demon from the rocks, sword drawn, his sudden presence causing 3 soldiers to surrender without firing a shot. The look in their eyes told Churchill everything. They'd heard the stories about the British officer with medieval weapons, had dismissed them as propaganda, and now confronted the reality that some legends were true. In Yugoslavia, fighting alongside partisans against both Germans and Croatian Ustase, Churchill learned that war's cruelty had depths modern armies had scarcely touched. Civilians massacred for supporting resistance fighters.
Village burned.
Bodies left hanging from trees as warnings. The mechanized efficiency of the Western Front was clean compared to the Balkans' intimate savagery. Here, Churchill's weapons seemed almost appropriate, almost honest. When you killed a man with a sword, you stood close enough to see his eyes, to smell his fear and your own. You couldn't pretend it was antiseptic, couldn't hide behind technology's comforting distance. War revealed itself as what it had always been. Humans killing humans, dressed up in uniforms and flags and ideologies, but ultimately just murder on an industrial scale. Churchill fought on because stopping wasn't an option, because Britain needed every man willing to fight, because surrender to fascism was unthinkable. But the romance, if it had ever existed, was gone. War was his profession now, his identity, possibly his addiction. He was good at it in ways that disturbed him when he allowed himself to think about it. The bow and sword weren't about chivalry or honor. They were about efficiency and psychology and maintaining some fragment of individuality in a war that treated men as interchangeable components. His commanding officers wrote citations describing his conspicuous gallantry and leadership under fire. He received the Distinguished Service Order with the Military Cross. Higher command debated whether he was a brilliant unconventional thinker or a functional madman who'd eventually get himself killed. Churchill himself stopped worrying about the distinction. May 1944. Yugoslavia. Churchill led a force of 40 commandos and 100 partisans in a raid against a German garrison town. The intelligence suggested 200 German soldiers, standard defensive positions, nothing his combined force couldn't handle. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Churchill's force walked into an ambush. 500 German soldiers, reinforced with armor, supported by artillery. The partisans broke first, streaming back into the forest. The commandos tried to hold, but they were outnumbered 10-1, taking casualties from every direction. Churchill organized a fighting withdrawal, his sword and pistol working constantly, covering his men as they retreated. Then mortar rounds started falling, and the withdrawal became a rout. Churchill found himself separated, his radio operator dead, surrounded by German infantry in a ruined farmhouse that provided almost no cover. He fought with everything he had, pistol, grenades, his bow when he had seconds to aim, finally his sword when they rushed his position. He killed 6 men before they overwhelmed him, clubbing him to the ground with rifle butts, kicking him until ribs cracked. Through the haze of pain, Churchill thought, "So this is how it ends. Better than a hospital bed, at least." But it didn't end. The Germans, recognizing his rank and possibly intrigued by the sword and bow scattered around him, took Churchill prisoner instead of executing him. He spent the next several months in POW camps, first in Belgrade, then transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin, a transfer that should have been a death sentence, as Sachsenhausen was where special prisoners went to disappear. Churchill escaped twice. The first time, he walked out of the camp disguised as a worker, made it 50 miles through Germany before recapture. The second time, he and a Norwegian prisoner slipped through the perimeter fence and disappeared into the winter forest, surviving on stolen food and sheer stubbornness. German efficiency finally caught him again, but by then it was April 1945, the Reich was collapsing, and Churchill's captors were more concerned with surrender terms than securing prisoners. When American forces overran his camp, Churchill was found calmly playing cards with other POWs, his bow and sword, confiscated but never destroyed, because even his captors seemed reluctant to destroy such unusual trophies, recovered from the commandant's office. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. Churchill, repatriated to England, discovered he'd missed everything important. The Normandy invasion, the race across France, the crossing of the Rhine, all the operations he'd trained for, all the skills he'd honed, obsolete now that the war was essentially won. He was furious. "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks," he supposedly told friends, "we could have kept the war going another 10 years. The comment was quintessentially Churchill. Part joke, part truth, all delivered with the deadpan sincerity that made people wonder if he was serious. Because war, for all its horror, had given him purpose and meaning. War was where his peculiar talents mattered, where being eccentric and fearless and utterly committed to destroying the enemy made you valuable rather than strange. What did peacetime have for a man who charged machine guns with a sword? He volunteered for Burma, where fighting against Japan continued. He arrived just in time for the atomic bombs to end that war too. Churchill found himself in a world where wars were ended by physics and buttons rather than courage and steel, where individual valor mattered less than industrial capacity and scientific achievement. The future had no place for warriors, only for soldiers. Jack Churchill lived until 1996, dying at age 89, long enough to see the world transform beyond recognition. The wars he fought became history, then nostalgia, finally mythology. New generations knew World War II through films and textbooks, sanitized and simplified until it became a story of clear heroes and villains, of righteous struggle against absolute evil. The reality, the mud and blood and casual cruelty, the moments of grace and horror existing side by side, the complexity of men like Churchill who killed with medieval weapons and modern efficiency, faded into anecdote. But the legend persisted. Mad Jack Churchill, the officer who brought a bow and sword to World War II, became a fixture in strange but true military histories, in Reddit threads and history podcasts, in bar conversations among veterans and history enthusiasts. He became a meme before memes existed, a figure so improbable that he transcended his own reality and became symbolic. Symbolic of what? That was the question that kept circulating decade after decade. Perhaps Churchill represented rebellion against modernity's dehumanizing efficiency. In an age where bombing runs could kill thousands without the bomber crews ever seeing their victims, where artillery struck targets miles away, where war became mathematical and clinical, Churchill's insistence on fighting face-to-face, weapon in hand, visible to friend and enemy alike, was a kind of protest. A statement that war's essential nature, humans killing humans, shouldn't be hidden behind technology's comfortable distance. Or perhaps he represented the opposite, a refusal to accept that old ways and old values had become obsolete. Medieval weapons in a modern war weren't a statement of principle but a stubborn insistence that tradition and skill could still matter in a world being remade by industry and science. Churchill's bow and sword were rebellion against the future, a doomed but glorious attempt to fight the 20th century on 14th century terms. Or maybe, and this was the interpretation that gained traction in later decades, Churchill was simply mad in the most useful possible way. War requires a certain suspension of sanity, a willingness to risk death for abstractions like nation and duty. Most soldiers achieved this through training and discipline, suppressing doubt through obedience. Churchill achieved it through authenticity. He fought with bow and sword not because regulations required it or tradition demanded it, but because that's genuinely who he was. In a war that demanded conformity and dehumanization, Churchill remained aggressively, undeniably himself. And that, paradoxically, made him one of the war's most effective warriors. The commandos he trained, the enemies he killed, the prisoners he captured, the operations he led, the tactical details mattered far less than the example he set. Churchill proved that individual courage still mattered in an industrial war, that audacity and imagination could compensate for limited resources, that one man willing to charge machine guns with a sword could inspire hundreds of others to follow him into hell. Was it rational? Absolutely not. Was it effective? Undeniably. The contradiction defined Churchill's legacy. He was a warrior anachronism, a medieval knight born 4 centuries too late, fighting in a war where knights were obsolete and yet somehow essential. He killed Germans with arrows while Allied bombers reduced their cities to ash. He led raids with a sword while Manhattan Project scientists assembled atomic weapons. He played bagpipes while machine guns rattled and tanks advanced. None of it should have worked. All of it did. In his later years, Churchill rarely spoke publicly about the war. When pressed, he'd offer self-deprecating anecdotes or sardonic commentary, deflecting any attempts to romanticize his service. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that war wasn't glorious. It was necessary occasionally but never glorious. The bow and sword hadn't transformed him into a hero. They'd transformed him into a weapon, a carefully honed instrument of violence, deployed by commanders who understood his value but couldn't quite classify him in normal military terms. He'd survived not because of his medieval arsenal but because of skill, luck, and a kind of insane fearlessness that made him exceptionally dangerous in close combat. The mythology that grew around Mad Jack was partly truth, partly embellishment, partly propaganda. The real Churchill was more complex and considerably darker than the legend suggested. But legends serve their own purpose. They inspire, provoke thought, remind people that individuals can matter even when history seems driven by impersonal forces. Jack Churchill, drawing a longbow behind a wall in Dunkirk, became a legend because he did something impossible. He fought a modern war on his own terms, with weapons his enemies thought extinct, and not only survived but excelled. In doing so, he answered a question nobody knew they were asking. Can courage and skill and sheer bloody-minded determination matter in an age of machines? The answer, written in German blood across France, Norway, Italy, and Yugoslavia, was yes. But the cost, to Churchill, to his enemies, to everyone who fought and died in that war, was terrible beyond words. War always extracts payment. Churchill's payment was decades of nightmares, of waking at 3 a.m. remembering faces of men he'd killed, of wondering if his gallantry was really just sanctioned murder dressed in medals and citations. He'd survived the war only to spend the rest of his life fighting its ghost. The bow and sword eventually went into museums. The bagpipes fell silent. The warrior became an old man telling stories to grandchildren who couldn't quite believe their grandfather had done the things the history books claimed. And the world moved on, as it always does, replacing one generation's nightmares with the next generation's challenges. But the legend remained. Mad Jack Churchill, the last warrior, the man who brought a bow to a gunfight and won. Not because his weapons were superior, they weren't. Not because war rewarded courage over firepower, it didn't. But because sometimes, in the midst of mechanized horror, one man's refusal to become just another uniformed cog in the military machine could matter more than strategy or logistics or technological advantage. Sometimes, one man with a sword could change history, even if history never quite figured out what to do with him. And that's the extraordinary story of Jack Churchill. A man who proved that even in modernity's darkest hour, when war became an industrial nightmare, individual courage could still matter, and one warrior's refusal to abandon the old ways could become a legend that echoed through generations. If you found this story as gripping as we did, please subscribe to the channel. We're dedicated to bringing you the most fascinating, untold stories from history. Hit that like button to help others discover Mad Jack's incredible tale. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you could bring one outdated skill or tradition into the modern world, what would it be and why? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.